Hey students, here's our last lecture for the 1920s. Last lecture of 2020 is going to be this one. Thanks for watching and taking notes. So this is lecture 2 of 2 about the 1920s. And so talking about the roaring 20s, we'll get to kind of how what happens ends up leading to our worst financial collapse and crisis in American history, known as the Great Depression in the 1930s. So that's kind of going to be where we lead. We'll also talk about the culture of the 1920s as pretty pivotal. And again, a lot of parallels between now and then in the 1920s as well. So this is where we left off last time. I was talking about society in the 1920s. Remember, we talked about some of the other major issues that came about. So I'm just condensing this, making it short and sort of a neatly sealed and packed container for you to take notes on. So the first person I want to talk about is the flapper. This is a term given to the new, fun-loving young women of the time who had shorter hair, shorter dresses, shorter necklines, so really challenged many of their traditions about how women are supposed to appear in public as far as their appearance, and sort of buck those trends. And you see, have a couple of pictures of flappers in the 1920s. Now, necessarily girls didn't call themselves flappers. Sometimes they did. Take on sort of this term to try to sort of buck tradition and trend. And therefore, obviously, many Americans are going to disapprove of the way women are projecting themselves, kind of sexualizing themselves, kind of objectifying the way that they are. And it was going to determine a different response from men and society. But it's going to symbolize sort of a revolution in manners and morals, and women saying, hey, we don't have to fit in this contained sort of environment and contain imagery of who women are supposed to be. So we can be outside of that and enjoy sort of the freedoms and cultural revolution that started in the 1920s with women. Again, this is going to be another sort of stop in a long line of women achieving equality or sort of a sense of equalness in American culture. And so this is another step on that path for women. Also in the 1920s, there's going to be a tremendous amount of movement of people now that sort of society and our economy opens up and begins to boom. For many people, we're going to see Americans taking advantage of this economic opportunity, specifically in the South. We're going to see a lot of former slaves and African Americans that have been free or born free leaving the South in search of more opportunities. So they're going to leave the South and the sharecropping system that is still going to entangle many African Americans in the South to the North, seeking better opportunities, better outcome for their families, economically working in factories or just even farming in the West, or congregating in places like in the Northwest for the first time. Many African Americans are going to be moving to the Northwest in the 1920s for the first time. Also, we're going to see a lot of refugees from World War I trickle in and apply for entry into the United States as well. Remember, we're going to have the quota system, so it's not going to be anyone that wants to come is going to be able to, but we have this special sort of right that when you're a refugee, you can ask for asylum, present your case in front of a judge, and then give yourself and your family entry into America if your life is pretty much devastated and you can't rebuild in your home country. And so we're going to have both of those, just immigrants naturalizing just because, and then also those that are claiming asylum or refugee status. One of the cool things that America does is that asylum refugee status. And then number 3, we're going to see that cities are going to grow. As more and more people are leaving the farms or immigrating from other countries, cities are going to continue to grow because they're a place that provides jobs and industry. You don't have to farm and live off of what you farm and do with your hands. Now you can work a job and achieve a wage that then you can go and buy things with. And so people are also going to expand into outside of city areas that we call the suburbs. So they're not urban, they're suburban. Right? Does that make sense? So for short, we just call them suburbs instead of suburban. I mean, it's a great car too, a big car, but suburban refers to just outside of the cities. So cities are going to grow so big that people still want more of a tranquil life, right? And maybe a bigger house or more place for their kids to play. So they're going to spread out. So they're also going to grow at this time as well. Okay, and so people are still going to be leaving farms and immigrating and growing and swelling the population of cities and now suburbs too. There's going to be some great American heroes, like some of them you met in the dinner party. Charles Lindbergh is going to be the first person ever to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. And so this is the easiest way because it goes with the wind and the jet streams go that way. It'd be incredibly tough and longer, and it'd take many more years before someone could fly against that current. So Charles Lindbergh flew from New York to Paris, and he just made himself sandwiches. That's the only thing he ate. This is his plane here. It's now in the National Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. You can see it. There's not even any windows looking out the front. He had to fly, land, and take off by looking out the side of the plane. It was just basically a big gas engine plus the engine propeller, and then him sitting in it. And he was a pretty skinny, he's tall but skinny and lightweight. So he becomes the first person to do that. And shortly thereafter, the first woman, very famous pilot in her own right, Amelia Earhart, becomes the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. So we have the first man, then the first woman, and then Amelia Earhart tries to be the first person, man or woman, to fly all the way around the world. And obviously you can't do it at one time, but she makes stops along the way. And she makes it all the way from America across the Atlantic to Europe, and then hops over through Asia. And then it's when she starts to go across the Pacific and connecting via the different islands that she goes missing. And she's still never been found. There's lots of good Discovery History Channel shows on where is she? We found her wreckage. It's her, it's her DNA. It's all kind of theory. And you watch one show and they say she is on this island, they prove it. You watch another one and they say she's on a different island, that's her remains. And she lived to be until she was 80 years old. So it just depends which show you watch. But very famous, and probably one of our most famous pilots in American history. And then Babe Ruth, very famous baseball player, probably our most famous in all time, Babe Ruth. His name is Herman Ruth. He went by the Babe. And so he played for the Red Sox, and then he left the Red Sox and placed a curse on them when he went to the Yankees. And so the Red Sox had this curse for almost 100 years until they finally won the World Series. What was that, 2005? I want to say, and broke Babe Ruth's curse that he placed on them. So kind of a funny story. Also, movies are going to be a tremendous part of culture in the 1920s, and they become widespread. Most or all American cities are probably going to have movie theaters. Towns, maybe not so much, but once you get to big cities, they're going to have movie theaters because it was relatively cheap. If you remember, this isn't the invention of movies in the 1920s, but still they used to be nickels. Now they raised the price to 10 cents. They don't call them Dimelodians like they did Nickelodeons, just movie theaters. Okay. And most Americans could afford tickets at that price. So sometimes they're seeing 1, 2, 3 movies a week. It was kind of the fun thing to do. And the movie theaters you're going to in the 1920s get built into this very grand experience where you have the red velvet curtains, you have the silver screen, you have great concessions. It was supposed to be an experience just going to the movie theater. You're supposed to sort of walk into and be transported into like a king or kingdom and a castle. And so a lot of these incredibly built movie theaters. I don't know if you've been to the Paramount in downtown Seattle and watch a concert there. It's very much the same thing. It was built during the time, very elaborate theater, right? So you walk in and you're just very grandiose, very beautiful. And that's part of the experience of going to the movies. Now you go to the movies, it's just, give me my popcorn, let me go sit. And my movie experience is watching a great movie with great effects and great action, right? So kind of a bit different from the 1920s, but still same idea. You're getting transported into a new spot. And the kind of the cool thing is that nationwide, they have release dates. So allowing theaters and production companies to send out movies nationwide, and then they release it on a certain day. So everyone's seeing the same movie at the same time was a tremendous hit as well. And so you see about 100 million tickets a week are being sold in the late 1920s. Okay. And at that time, our population is about 90,000. So that's about one movie per person per week in the 1920s, which not everyone has seen movies. So a lot of people are doubling up and purchasing multiple tickets a week. But that shows you the tremendous sort of popularity of movies in the 1920s. And then sports, because people are working jobs as managers or in factories, they have this money to spend. So one way that people like to enjoy themselves is with their leisure time or by watching other people compete. And so baseball becomes America's pastime in the 1920s with the popularity of Babe Ruth and being a good pitcher and a good hitter, and then the Yankees being very dominant in the 1920s. So that becomes America's pastime. The second most popular sport actually is boxing in the 1920s. And thousands of Americans are going to fill stadiums to watch boxing matches like Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was built for boxing matches. So thousands of people could watch a boxing match. And it's now used for concerts, and New York Knicks and basketball plays there, but it was built originally as a boxing stadium. And when it's in its heyday, it can fill, and be packed full of people to watch boxing matches. So now popular athletes for the first time are becoming national heroes, very similar to today, right? We love our athletes like Russell Wilson here in town, or even in golf, Tiger Woods, and we hold them up on this pedestal. They're heroes because they've done something athletically that very few people can do and will probably never do. So hold them in tremendous regard. Also, like has been mentioned, so jazz invented and created in the 1920s, and it's a combination of African, Caribbean rhythms, sort of slave narratives and slave songs that come out of America in the 1800s as well. So it's a combination and infusion of all these musical elements, but it is an African American based music. And it doesn't mean only African Americans can play it, but it's going to expand outside to other races, of course. And most cultures have embraced around the world some sort of form of jazz. But it's essentially that you have a small group. It could be a trumpet player. So you have brass, you have maybe a big bass, for instance, playing bass. You have the piano. So it's a couple of different of instruments. It could be like a duet or a bigger group. But you have this idea of improvisation. You're playing a melody, and then that melody could change. And then it's going off of the other melodies that the other players are playing as well. And so it's unique in that it originally wasn't written down. It becomes written down, and you can still play jazz music that's written down, very famous songs, but it becomes sort of the sequence of improvisation, which leads to tremendous sort of concerts that cannot be really replicated. It's kind of how it starts in the 1920s. So very cool kind of music movement. And the base for jazz was originally New Orleans, with Louis Armstrong being catapulted into prominence. Also in Memphis, kind of becomes a small hub, but that major spot was in New York City. So if you had any sort of musical talent as a jazz musician, you wanted to end up in New York City in some big popular clubs, like the Cotton Club was the most famous. If you made it there, then you had made it in jazz music and you were one of the greats. Duke Ellington, one of the greats, Louis Armstrong. There's a lot of others, especially that come not just in the 1920s, but later too, and follow in this great movement. Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk, some great jazz musicians in American history out there if you enjoy listening to jazz. But it gets its start in the 1920s. So also, which helps foster jazz music, is sort of this renaissance, sort of this rebirth in culture, specifically for African Americans in the 1920s, as many are moving from the South into the North and experiencing new freedoms and sort of new rights, maybe they haven't necessarily had in the South. Sort of what awakens with these newfound rights and freedoms is this idea of being able to express yourself. And so African Americans are really expressing themselves in different cultural ways, really for the first time, and being able to assemble together and sort of collaborate, not just in music, but also in literature and other art forms and acting and in theater. And so historians call that time period in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance, really based out of Harlem, New York. Was going to be the hub for many of these artists and writers to sort of congregate, just like I said, New York City and the Cotton Club for jazz musicians. Well, you really have the center being in Harlem and New York City that a lot of artists are congregating to and feeding off of each other, stimulating each other, and really creating some great pieces of art And so for African Americans, it was them expressing their voice, having a voice, and expressing their anger and hatred or racism, which even though through the Civil War, Reconstruction, their sort of racism is squashed, the end of slavery, there's still the racism that is going to exist in the South and even in northern cities of repression through Jim Crow laws. And those are going to still exist. So, but now African Americans kind of have the right and the freedoms to be able to express themselves in a way where they're openly calling for the end of Jim Crow laws, for the end of segregation. And this movement is also going to catapult African Americans and all people of color into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. We aren't there yet. It's going to take another 30 years, and we're going to have the Depression and World War II that happen in between them. But it's a lot of those civil rights leaders are going to sort of be born and birthed in the 1920s and then experience sort of that expression and continue that into the 1950s and 60s in the modern civil rights movement. Or base their arguments off of those that wrote those arguments in the 1920s. One of the most famous artists of this time is Langston Hughes, famous poet and writer, amongst other musicians, actors, actresses, academics, African Americans going to college and becoming well educated and doing interesting studies and diatribes on culture in America and history in America is going to be very good in this time as well. So continuing on, I will lastly want to touch on the economy, which is going to be booming throughout most of the 1920s. That's why it's called the Roaring 20s. But as we get to 1929, we're going to experience an economic collapse that's going to lead us into what we call a depression. Okay, so what's going to happen in the 1920s that leads us to a depression? Well, businesses in the 1920s are going to boom. So, and how are they going to do so well? For the first time, banks are going to offer what they call credit, and not just banks, but also other industries. If you want to buy an automobile, for instance, you can take out a loan with the Ford Motor Company on credit. So you're going to pay the Ford Motor Company a bit every month plus interest to purchase a vehicle. And so if you want to buy a sewing machine but didn't have the money up front to pay for it, you could take out a loan, right, and buy it on credit. Same thing with any other sort of major appliance or even a house that we call a mortgage is the same idea. And so because people don't have to have all this money saved up and to upfront, now they can take out these loans and to purchase things on loan and be paying that way. What that is going to do is allow people to buy lots of stuff and then make their payments, of course. But when that happens nationwide and internationally, it's going to create this business boom in which businesses are going to be doing very well because they're selling all this stuff because people are able to buy it now, thanks to the kind of invention of credit. Not credit cards. Credit cards come out in the 1950s, but credit, this idea of having credit, so putting a little bit down and then receiving that item and then paying on it every month, including interest, comes out in the 1920s. There's also going to be new electrical appliances creating a new demand for electricity, creating a new demand for the appliances that they're making, like the washing machine is going to come out in the 1920s. And still has to be kind of improved upon. It does in the 1950s, but gets its start then. So, and then also advertisers, like we were learning from some of the famous people like Bruce Barton, are going to be selling items trying to appeal to emotions, saying that this certain thing has sex appeal. And so that's going to drive demand to purchase that. Or this one is going to make you look cool, or you're driving this car, so it's going to be awesome. So now we're having advertisers starting to appeal to emotions, saying like you're incomplete unless you have this object. So we start to see those trends appear in the 1920s. And Henry Ford's going to invent the assembly line and make it popular on a wide scale. It had been around, but he doesn't use it, like no other inventor uses it as effectively as the Ford Motor Company. And so because the automobile is going to become so popular because it becomes so cheap through the assembly line, mass producing these cars quickly and fairly easily, hundreds of new businesses are going to be based upon the automobile. If you've ever seen the movie Cars, I love that. My kids love watching it. It's that same idea, right? Where people have to be served in the automobile. They need tires, they need gas, they need a place to stay if they're going on a trip. You know, you need roads to drive on. So there's all these people that are going to receive jobs from sort of the transportation revolution that happens as Americans are buying and able to afford cars. And then what do they want to do? To go drive places, drive to work, drive to the park, and go for a picnic, things along those lines. So it's going to help foster sort of a new economic revolution in America. That's really another reason businesses are so successful in the 1920s. And 4/5 of all the cars in the world at this time are owned by Americans. It's a very American idea, right? To have a car and own it. It's why when you turn 16, you want a car, you'd be able to drive around, you have these new freedoms. It's kind of in our psyche as an American that that's what happens when you turn 16. You have these new rights and freedoms of needing a car, and that you can only express when you have a car. But also there's going to be sort of differences between who has stuff in the 1920s and who does not. So between 1923 to 29 is a great time for most Americans. And we're going to see the middle class really explode. So you have the rich, you have the poor, and then in the middle, you have what's called the middle class. They're going to be the ones that are like the managers. They're, it takes education to have their job. But they're going to receive more money in the 1920s than they ever have before. And they're going to be spending that money on buying things like cars or appliances, and then buying things on credit. And so they're going to have tremendous terms of wealth, and also an improved standard of living more so than ever. But still, there's going to be people that are disproportionately affected. And they're going to be farmers who are going to experience prices dropping for crops in the 1920s, because there's no world war going anymore. So it's not that crops are scarce, but there's going to be an abundance and overproduction of crops in the 1920s. Which is going to hurt us as we get to the Great Depression in the 1930s too. And then miners, as electricity, less people need coal to burn in their house to stay warm, because now we can electrify things and generate heat that way, and heat water that way. So there's going to be a less demand for coal. And so this is going to hurt many miners throughout the country. And so the result is, even though why we call it the Roaring 20s, 2/3 of Americans are going to benefit in this time, still 1/3 of Americans are going to live in poverty in the 1920s. So the haves and have-nots. And so when that happens, it is a dangerous sign. As the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And so that's a sign of kind of impending economic doom, because when there's less and less people that can buy things, as in the poor are getting poorer, then really that leads to economic decline. Number 2, Americans are going to be experiencing personal debt. They're counting on future income to cover their debts that they have. They need to make an income or a certain amount of money in order to cover their debts. When that doesn't happen, we can also slide into a recession. That's what happened in 2008, when not enough Americans can afford their mortgage payment. They start to default on their loans, and that has an effect on the whole economy because they can't pay their debts. Number 3, the stock market. High stock prices are going to encourage what's called speculation, where people are buying stocks on credit. It's called to speculate, and they're hoping that stocks go up. But when stocks don't go up enough to cover your losses, then it's going to create a problem for the economy as well. And as well, businesses are overproducing. They're going to be making more goods than people are buying. And what do you do when you have too much? Well, it just sits around. And if no one buys it, then you don't get the money that it took to generate and to make that thing. And so you start to go into debt as well. And then lastly, there's going to be trouble for farmers, because they're growing crops to try to feed people, but there's not enough people that need those crops because there's an overabundance of food being produced. So they also aren't able to pay their debts. So those are some of the warning signs that bad times are coming. And that's what we're going to get into on our next unit. When we come back from holiday break, we're going to be talking about how we slide into the Great Depression. So that's some warning signs to sort of get us ready. But when we come back, we'll talk more about how do we actually get into the worst economic disaster in American history that we call the Great Depression. Okay. So again, a lot of parallels between the 1920s and today. Even sort of our economy right now is experiencing the same thing, where we have the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer right now. We had a tremendous economic success the last couple of years, and since this coronavirus now, like, it's created sort of that sort of schism, the split between the haves and the have-nots again. So is that going to create sort of economic problems in 2021? we'll have to see. So that's kind of the scary thing for historians and economics that are looking at it. But so this is good. We'll take a mini quiz on this. Thanks for watching, taking your notes. Good job.